When it comes to maximizing revenue on your short-term rental, one thing I always say is that pricing is an art and a science. The vast majority of people who own short-term rentals, especially new hosts, are leaving a massive amount of money on the table when it comes to pricing. So in this video, I'm going to go over 3 different pricing hacks that have led to us projecting this year an extra $60,000 in revenue across our properties. And it's going to help you, especially if you're a new host, to lock in the highest revenue possible on your short-term rental as well. Hey, I'm Kirby Atwell from Living Off Rentals, and when it comes to pricing your short-term rental, the biggest challenge for a lot of people is getting over that initial mental hurdle around pricing. A lot of people who are getting into the short-term rental space are doing so from the long-term traditional type of rental space, or they're getting into short-term rentals and they can see what the long-term market rent is for that property that they're buying, and logically, it's a challenge for them to ask 3, 4, 5, up to 10 times as much in some cases for the exact same property on a short-term rental basis. It makes sense. And so what people do is they look at it and they say, well, if I can double my income using this property as a short-term rental as opposed to a long-term rental, then I'm doing great. Why do I need to ask 4 or 5 times as much, even though that's what the market will allow? We fell into this category with our first vacation rental when we started renting our basement unit several years ago, and we were just celebrating to have this extra income coming in, and now looking back, we probably could have made double what we were asking at the time. So first off, before we get into the 3 pricing hacks, it's important to recognize that just as a general rule, you might be priced way too low. And you'll recognize this if your entire calendar is booked up for the next 4 or 5 months. That's typically a surefire sign that you're leaving a massive amount of revenue on the table and that you could be charging a higher price. The other mental shift that I think is really important to make before we dive into the 3 hacks is that there's no such thing as a dollar per night type property. So you'll hear people all the time, especially when they're first getting started, say, oh, this is a $500 per night type property, or this is a $150 per night type property. And that might be the average across the whole year, but recognize that there's no such thing as a dollar amount tied to a property. What there is there's supply and there's demand. And that's going to dictate the nightly rate on all properties, and it's based on each individual night throughout the year. So for example, we have a property that we paid $75,000 for, and we put another $125,000 into totally gut. So we got about $200,000 into it. And this property is going to rent for over $1,000 per night, several nights this summer. And then the rest of the summer is going to be slightly under that. However, in the wintertime, especially during weekdays in the winter, it can get down to $119 per night. So if we didn't recognize the difference in supply and demand during the different seasons, then we would either way overprice it in the winter because we'd be stuck that this property is a $1,000 per night type property and we would never rent this out for $119 per night, or we'd be looking at the $119 per night in the winter and way underprice it, maybe raise it to double that in the summer and think we're doing great, and not recognize that we could get almost 10 times that in the summer, because that's what supply and demand dictates. There's nowhere near enough properties in our area during the busy summertime, especially around like the 4th of July holiday, for the amount of families that want to travel together. And this property is unique in that it's, walking distance to Lake Michigan, and it sleeps, 12 different people because it's a 5-bedroom property with a pull-out couch. So when you have a property like that, you can't just assign a nightly rate and say this is the nightly rate for this property. You have to understand the supply and demand dynamics in your particular market. So now for the 3 pricing hacks that are going to allow us to bring in an extra $60,000 of revenue across our entire portfolio. Number 1 is turning on bigger discounts for longer stays in the off-season. Typically in the high season, for most people, you're going to be booked up at an extremely high occupancy rate. So because of that, it doesn't make very much sense to turn on a big discount for longer stays. Why would I want to give somebody a 15, 20% discount for staying for 15 days or 30 days or 2 months if I'm gonna get those days booked at a 15 or 20 or 30% premium by booking them as individual days or shorter stays? So in the high season, I recommend either turning off or turning way down your discount for longer stays. However, on the flip side, this is when it's really important to pay attention to your seasonality. I recommend turning up a much bigger discount for longer stays in the off season. The reason we do this is because vacancy can often be one of the most costly factors when operating your short-term rental business. If you think about it, if you've got a property that rents on average for about $200 per night, if you were willing to offer a 30% discount and get a booking for the next 30, 60, 90 days, for a long-term booking from a nurse, a traveling nurse, or somebody traveling for work, somebody that can't afford that property at the full nightly rate, but they can afford to book it long-term at a discounted rate, now you've got 100% occupancy. So 100% occupancy on a $200 night property that you've given a 30% discount on is going to net you $4,200 of income, whereas your occupancy rate dropped down to 50% and you were to book it at the full $200 a night rate, now you're only making $3,000 in that same month. So you're getting a higher nightly rate, you're getting the full $200, but you're at a 50% occupancy because it's the off season, and that's what the occupancy rate is in the off season. But if you're willing to give a 30% discount on that property, you're actually making $1,200 more per month on that same property, even though you're discounting the nightly rate because you've got the full 100% occupancy. Hack number 2, and this is a very tough one to wrap your head around, especially if you're a new host. But what we do is going into the high season, and we start this several months before the high season, we ask a 20 to 30% premium above what our pricing software is suggesting or what the comparable properties in the area are asking. And we also set a minimum nightly booking of 4 to 5 nights. So they can't book anything less than that going into the high season. Now let me explain why we do this and why you might want to do this as well. So for our market, Michigan City, Indiana, which probably operates very similar to a lot of other markets, there's a low season and a high season. Most of our bookings are long weekends. It's not a lot of families traveling together because kids are in school, right? So that's again why we offer a much bigger discount for longer stays in the low season. So in the low season, higher occupancy, lower nightly rate. Going into the high season, we know based on the past several years, we're going to get pretty much every single night booked up. Even times when we've had a last minute cancellation, we typically get that booked up right away again because there's nowhere near enough supply for the amount of demand in the high season. And that's typically what you see in a lot of markets. In the high season, there's just not enough supply. And so if we ask a premium farther out, we know we're probably not going to get booked far out. In the beginning, we made the error of setting a lower price, and so we'd get our entire summer booked up, and it would feel good, inside we'd feel like, oh yay, we just got our entire summer booked up, but we wouldn't recognize that we just left a ton of money on the table. So now we charge this premium and we don't get booked up way in advance. But if you think about it, every single day as you get closer to the high season, there's less and less inventory, right? Because yesterday people were looking for places to stay in the summer and they booked up a certain amount of places. And then today they booked up, more people were looking and they booked up those places, and the places that were already booked are no longer available. And every day as you get closer, there's less and less inventory to a place in an area where we know that there's just not gonna be enough properties for everyone who wants to travel, especially around the busiest times of the summer. If there's a festival, if it's 4th of July, if it's Memorial Day, if it's Labor Day, all these times when people really love to take vacations and travel. So this is when it becomes extremely important to understand your market, understand the supply and demand, and to monitor. So we set this 20 to 30% premium, knowing that we're probably not going to get booked way out, but we monitor every week as we get closer to see how many comparable properties are available. Now what price point are they at? And again, this is why it's so important not to say, well, this property is a X amount per night type property, because it was yesterday, but today it's different because there's a totally different amount of supply. So if you monitor the supply, you'll start to see that as properties get booked up, the nightly rate for the properties that are available is higher, because all things equal, if two properties are equal, obviously the person's going to book the cheaper property. But now that property's off the table. It's no longer available. So now the next person to search, your property might be the next cheapest property. So it's important to monitor what's available and to hold out. And this is a very tough exercise to do as you get closer to the booking day. A lot of people will just drop it down because they're like, I just want to have it booked up a month out. And you might need to hold out until a couple weeks before to start dropping your pricing, start decreasing the minimum number of nights, but you'll be surprised to find we're still getting bookings at a 20 to 30% premium now, and those are just going to continue to pick up as we get closer to those booking days. The third and final hack when it comes to pricing is actually something that you can't just adjust right now, but it is something that you can adjust strategically as you move forward with your short-term rental business. And that is focusing on buying properties that are larger properties. I'm talking 4, 5, 6 bedroom properties, or properties you can convert into 4, 5, 6 bedroom properties. You know, maybe a 3 bedroom with a big unfinished basement where you can add more bedrooms and living space to accommodate more guests. Or buying a 2 to 4 unit property. We have 3 different 2 unit properties that all perform exceedingly well, and the purchase price is very similar to a single family home. So on the expense side, it's very similar to a single family home, but on the revenue side, we're doubling our revenue in a lot of cases because the nightly rate really isn't that much less than the same property as a single family home. So I like the large properties because if you think about it, the typical guest in these larger properties is multiple families traveling together. That's who's going to book up a 5-bedroom. It's not going to be a couple that books a 5-bedroom property typically. It's going to be, you know, aging parents and their 2 kids and their kids, so that they all have space in the same property together, and paying a massive premium at, you know, $1,000+ per night isn't totally unreasonable for average people if they're sharing that cost amongst 3, 4 different families. So you can get a much, much higher nightly rate. Plus there's just not nearly enough of these type of properties for larger groups that want to travel. There's a lot more 3-bedroom, 1-bath type properties out there than there are 6-bedroom, 3, 4-bath type properties. So if you can find those type of properties, you're going to get a much higher premium on your nightly rate. Or if you can't find those type of properties, searching out 2 to 4 unit properties kind of serve the same purpose. You get individual units that you can book by themselves, or you can book the entire building as a separate listing. People can book the entire building if they're multiple families traveling together. So as I said, this isn't a hack that you can change immediately, but as you continue to add more properties to your portfolio, I think it's super important to keep this type of thing in mind so you can add the highest profiting properties to your portfolio that you possibly can. So if you institute these pricing hack changes in your short-term rental business, I think you're going to see a big positive change in your revenue. If you got something out of this video, hit that like button. Also, if you don't have a vacation rental yet, you don't have a short-term rental, but you're interested in getting one, then I've got a perfect masterclass for you. Go to livingoffrentals.com/start, and I recorded a free masterclass there that's going to walk you through the most important things you need to know to get a property in the next 30 days. There's also a link there if you're interested in working with me personally on how to find, buy, and set up your first high cash flowing vacation rental. You can book a call with me and we can discuss your goals and see if my program, the First Vacation Rental Investment Blueprint, might be a good fit for you. I hope you'll check out the masterclass, but regardless, I'll see you in the next video.